The moment they call you not enough is the moment your real power begins. The chandeliers of the Beverly Hills Grand Ballroom shimmered like captured starlight, casting a golden glow over gowns that cost more than most homes and tuxedos tailored to perfection, and yet none of that brilliance could hide the quiet tension coiling in Avery Brooks' chest as she stepped across the polished marble floor, her heels echoing softly in a room that seemed to measure worth in bloodlines and bank accounts. She paused for just a breath, fingers brushing the simple diamond ring on her hand, not large, not loud, but chosen with intention, unlike the eyes now turning toward her, calculating, questioning, dismissing. "Excuse me, miss, this section is for invited guests only." The hostess's voice was polite but firm, rehearsed, as if Avery had already failed a test she didn't know she was taking. Avery offered a calm smile. "I am invited," her voice steady, controlled, but the woman's gaze flicked over her again, slower this time, taking in the understated navy dress, the absence of glittering labels, the quiet confidence that didn't match their expectations. Whispers began to ripple through the room like a low tide pulling back before a storm. "Isn't that Daniel Hayes' wife?" "No, that can't be her. She doesn't look like..." The sentence never finished, because it didn't need to. Avery felt it anyway, the weight of it, the judgment dressed as curiosity. She moved forward despite it, each step deliberate, as if she belonged there, because she did, didn't she? 5 years of marriage, 5 years of standing beside a man whose name opened doors she had never asked for. 5 years of learning that sometimes the quietest rooms were the loudest with unspoken truths. Across the ballroom, Daniel Hayes stood near the stage, his tailored charcoal suit catching the light, his posture perfect, his smile effortless as he spoke to investors and legacy families, men who built empires and women who protected them. Avery's gaze lingered on him, searching for something familiar, something grounding, but before she could reach him, a voice cut through the air, sharp and unmistakable. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." The room shifted, parting like a curtain as Eleanor Hayes approached, her presence commanding without raising her voice, diamonds resting at her collarbone like declarations of status. Her eyes met Avery's, cool, precise, assessing. "This event is reserved for family and distinguished guests," she continued, each word placed carefully, deliberately. "And I'm quite certain you don't fall into either category." A silence followed, thick and heavy, cameras subtly turning, conversations pausing mid-sentence. Avery didn't flinch, not outwardly, but something inside her stilled, like glass just before it cracks. "I'm Daniel's wife," she said, not loudly, not defensively, just truth, simple and undeniable. But Eleanor's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, but into something colder. "That," she replied, "is precisely the issue." And just like that, the illusion began to fracture. The golden light felt harsher, the air sharper, and somewhere across the room, Daniel finally looked up, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second, long enough for a decision to form, long enough for everything to begin falling apart. The silence did not break, it stretched, thin and sharp, as if the entire ballroom was holding its breath to see whether Avery Brooks would shatter or stand. And she chose to stand, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted just enough to remind herself that dignity was not something given by rooms like this, it was something carried quietly, deliberately. Eleanor Hayes took a small step closer, her heels clicking against the marble with controlled precision. "You may believe what you are saying," she continued, her tone calm but laced with something colder than anger, "but belief does not make it appropriate." A few guests exchanged glances, the kind that said they had seen this before, the quiet removal of someone who did not fit. Avery's fingers brushed her ring again, not out of uncertainty but out of memory. She remembered the day Daniel placed it on her hand, not in a ballroom, not in front of cameras, but in a quiet room with sunlight filtering through half-closed blinds, where promises had sounded simple and real. Now those promises felt distant, like echoes in a place she could no longer reach. Across the room Daniel began walking toward them, his expression unreadable, his pace steady, each step closing the distance between past and present. Avery watched him approach, searching his face for something, anything, that might anchor her in this moment. But what she saw was hesitation, carefully hidden, carefully controlled. And that hesitation spoke louder than any words he could have said. "Daniel," Eleanor said without turning, her voice softening just slightly, "there seems to be confusion." He stopped beside them, close enough for Avery to feel the faint trace of his cologne, familiar and distant at the same time. He did not look at her immediately, instead his gaze swept the room, taking in the watching eyes, the subtle movements of phones being lifted, the weight of reputation pressing down on him from every direction. When he finally looked at Avery, it was brief, almost careful, as if holding her gaze for too long would force him to choose before he was ready. "Avery," he said, her name quiet, controlled. "This is not the right setting." The words landed softly, but they carried the weight of distance, not defense, not protection, just distance. Avery felt something inside her settle, not break, not yet, but settle into a truth she could no longer ignore. "It seems like there are many things that are not right tonight," she replied, her voice steady, calm, every syllable measured. A few heads turned more sharply now, sensing the shift, sensing that something real was unfolding beneath the polished surface. Eleanor's expression tightened just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for Avery to see. "Security," Eleanor said, not raising her voice, yet the word carried across the space with quiet authority. Two men in dark suits stepped forward from the edges of the room, their movements professional, practiced, the kind of efficiency that removed problems without creating scenes. Avery did not move, not yet. She kept her eyes on Daniel, giving him the space, the moment, the choice, because this was his to make, not hers. The room seemed to lean in, waiting, watching, measuring the outcome. Daniel's jaw tightened, just a fraction, a sign only someone who knew him would notice. His hand shifted at his side, as if caught between reaching out and stepping back, and in that hesitation, Avery saw everything she needed to see. The love he once spoke of, the promises he once made, all weighed against the expectations of a room that would never accept her, and for a moment, it looked like he might speak, like he might step forward, like he might choose differently. But then the moment passed, quietly, almost imperceptibly, and the distance between them became something permanent, something undeniable. Avery exhaled slowly, not in defeat, but in clarity, the kind that arrives when illusions finally fall away. She turned her gaze slightly, taking in the room that had judged her without knowing her, the lights, the faces, the carefully curated perfection. And then she looked back at Daniel one last time, not asking, not pleading, just seeing him for who he was in this moment, and realizing that sometimes the most important decisions are not made with words, but with silence. The air shifted the moment Daniel did not speak, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that settled over the room like a verdict already delivered. The security men stopped just short of touching Avery, waiting, always waiting for confirmation from the people who mattered. And in that silence, Chloe Bennett stepped forward, her presence effortless, practiced, as if she had been standing in the wings of this moment all along. Her hand slid gently around Daniel's arm, not aggressively, not claiming, but enough to be seen, enough to be understood, and the gesture landed harder than any words could have. Avery's eyes followed the movement, steady, unblinking, taking in the quiet shift of allegiance that no one dared to name out loud. Chloe's smile was soft, almost sympathetic, but it did not reach her eyes. "I think there has been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice warm in a way that felt rehearsed. "Daniel has been under a lot of pressure lately, and sometimes things become complicated." The word lingered, carefully chosen, designed to sound kind. While rewriting the truth in real time, a few guests nodded subtly, relieved to have a narrative they could accept, something that restored order to the discomfort unfolding before them. Avery did not respond immediately. She simply watched, absorbing the scene with a clarity that felt almost detached, as if she were stepping outside of her own life and seeing it for what it truly was. Daniel shifted slightly, his arm not pulling away, not correcting, just allowing, and that allowance spoke louder than any denial. Eleanor's expression softened just enough to signal approval. The room recalibrated around that small change, power settling where it was expected to be. "This is exactly why discretion matters," Eleanor added, her tone now almost instructive, as though she were offering guidance rather than delivering judgment. "Some situations are better handled privately." Avery let out a slow breath, her pulse steadying, not because the moment was less painful, but because it was becoming clearer, sharper, defined. She glanced down briefly at the ring on her hand, the diamond catching the chandelier light for a fleeting second, a small, quiet sparkle in a room built on much louder displays. And then she looked back up, her gaze returning to Daniel, not searching anymore, not hoping, just seeing. "You could have said something," she said softly, not accusing, not pleading, simply stating a fact that hung in the air between them. Daniel's expression flickered, something close to regret, quickly contained, quickly buried beneath the expectations pressing in from every side. "This is not the place," he repeated, his voice lower now, as if lowering it would make the moment smaller, easier to manage. But the room had already grown too large, too aware, too invested. The cameras were no longer subtle, the whispers no longer quiet. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a revelation. And everyone knew it. The security men exchanged a glance, waiting for the final signal, for the moment when hesitation would end and action would begin. Avery straightened slightly, a subtle shift, but enough to reclaim something that had never truly left her: composure, dignity, presence. She did not step back, she did not argue, she did not raise her voice. Instead she reached up slowly and touched the ring one last time, not as a question, not as a plea, but as a farewell she did not need to announce. The music in the ballroom continued somewhere in the background, a soft instrumental piece that now felt distant, almost ironic, as if it belonged to a different story entirely. Avery's gaze moved across the room, taking in the faces, the expressions, the silent judgments that had already been made, and then it returned to Daniel for the final time. "I understand," she said, her voice calm, steady, final, and in that moment, the balance shifted, not visibly, not yet, but something fundamental had changed, something that no one in that room fully grasped, not even Daniel, not even Eleanor, not even Chloe, because they were still looking at her as if she were leaving with nothing, and they had no idea that this was the moment she was choosing everything. The words lingered in the air long after Avery spoke them, quiet yet absolute, and for a moment no one moved, not Eleanor, not Daniel, not even the security men who had been summoned to erase her presence as if she were an error in an otherwise perfect evening. Avery lowered her hand from the ring, her fingers steady, deliberate, and then she did something no one expected. She stepped forward, not toward the exit, not away in defeat, but through the space that had been closing in around her. Each step measured, each movement controlled, the sound of her heels against the marble floor now the only rhythm that mattered. Conversations did not resume, they paused, stretched, reshaped around her path. People moved just enough to let her pass, not out of respect, but out of instinct, as if something in her presence demanded space. Eleanor watched closely, her expression unreadable, but her posture tightened just slightly, the first crack in a facade built over decades of control. Chloe's hand remained on Daniel's arm, but her fingers pressed a little firmer now, sensing a shift she could not yet name. Daniel himself did not follow, did not call out, did not move to stop her, and that stillness sealed everything. Avery reached the edge of the ballroom where the grand glass doors opened toward the terrace, the city lights beyond shimmering like a distant promise. She paused there for just a second, not to look back, but to breathe, the cool air brushing against her skin as the doors parted with a soft mechanical whisper. Outside, the night was alive, distant traffic, muted conversations, the low hum of Los Angeles stretching out beneath the hills. It was a different world from the one she had just left, less polished, more real. Avery stepped onto the terrace, the noise of the ballroom fading behind her, replaced by something quieter, something steadier. She walked toward the edge where the view opened wide, the skyline glowing in the distance, and for the first time since the moment began, she allowed herself to feel it, not the humiliation, not the rejection, but the clarity, the kind that arrives when everything unnecessary falls away. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass beside her, a silhouette framed by light, composed, unbroken. She studied it for a brief moment, not questioning who she was, but remembering. Behind her, through the glass, she could see the room beginning to move again, people shifting, conversations restarting, the illusion repairing itself as if nothing significant had happened, as if she had already been erased. But Avery knew better, because something had changed, not in that room, but in her. The ring on her finger caught the city light once more, a final quiet gleam, and this time when she touched it, it was not hesitation, it was decision. She slid it off slowly, the movement unhurried, intentional, the small weight of it resting in her palm for a brief second before she closed her fingers around it, not throwing it away, not discarding it, but holding it as a piece of a chapter that had ended. She turned slightly, not to return, but to align herself with a different direction entirely, and just as she began to walk along the terrace, something cut through the night, low at first, distant, almost mistaken for the sound of the city itself, but then it grew louder, deeper, unmistakable, the rhythmic thrum of helicopter blades slicing through the air. Avery stopped, her gaze lifting instinctively toward the dark sky above. The sound intensified, echoing between the buildings, drawing attention not just from her, but from the people inside, heads turning, movement pausing once again, the night shifting around a presence that was rapidly approaching. And in that moment, before the aircraft even came into view, before the lights appeared, before anyone understood what was about to happen, Avery did not look surprised, she did not look confused, she simply stood there, calm, steady, as if she had been expecting this all along. The sound grew louder, no longer distant, no longer ignorable. It pressed into the night with a force that commanded attention without asking for permission, the rhythmic pulse of the helicopter blades echoing across the terrace, across the glass walls, across the carefully constructed calm of the ballroom behind her. Inside, conversations faltered again, heads turned sharply toward the source of the noise, confusion flickering across faces that were used to controlling every variable, every detail. Avery remained still, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as if the moment unfolding above them was not a disruption but a continuation, a sequence she already understood. The first beam of light cut through the darkness, sweeping across the terrace in a slow arc before settling, precise, intentional, illuminating her silhouette against the night. The helicopter descended into view, sleek, powerful, its polished surface catching the city lights as it lowered toward the private landing area adjacent to the terrace, a space reserved for those whose presence required more than a simple entrance. Inside the ballroom, the glass doors became a frame, turning the scene outside into something cinematic, something unreal. Guests moved closer, drawn by instinct, by curiosity, by the undeniable shift in energy. Eleanor stepped forward slightly, her gaze narrowing as she tried to place what she was seeing within the boundaries of her understanding, but there was no immediate explanation, no familiar pattern to follow. Daniel approached the glass now, his earlier composure replaced by something sharper, more focused, his eyes fixed on Avery, on the light surrounding her, on the aircraft that should not have been part of this evening. Chloe's grip on his arm loosened just enough to signal uncertainty. The helicopter touched down with controlled precision, the wind from its blades stirring the air, lifting strands of Avery's hair, brushing against the fabric of her dress. Yet she did not step back, she did not shield herself, she stood in it. Grounded, steady, as if the force of it only reinforced her presence. The door of the aircraft opened, and a man stepped out, his suit immaculate despite the movement, his posture direct, purposeful. He moved toward Avery without hesitation, without pause, as though this path had been mapped long before this night. When he reached her, he stopped at a respectful distance, his head inclining slightly, not in deference to the room behind her, but to her alone. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice clear even over the fading hum of the blades. "They are ready for you." The words were simple, but they carried weight, a different kind of authority, one that did not seek approval from the crowd watching through the glass, one that did not explain itself. Inside, a ripple moved through the guests, subtle at first, then growing, as recognition began to flicker in fragmented pieces. A name, a possibility, a realization that did not fully form but refused to be ignored. Avery nodded once, a small, controlled acknowledgement, as if this were expected, as if she had simply reached the next step in a sequence already set in motion. She opened her hand briefly, looking down at the ring resting in her palm, the diamond no longer catching the chandelier light, but reflecting something quieter, something final, and then she closed her fingers around it again, not as loss, but as closure. She lifted her gaze, not toward the ballroom, not toward Daniel, but forward, toward the aircraft, toward what came next. And as she took her first step in that direction, the balance shifted completely, not just in the room behind her, but in the story itself, because the woman they believed they were removing had never been the one leaving empty-handed. She was the one who had been called away. The distance between Avery and the helicopter was not more than 30 feet, but every step she took toward it seemed to stretch time itself, each movement deliberate, unhurried, as if she was no longer walking through a moment but through a transformation that had been waiting for this exact night to unfold. Behind the glass walls, the ballroom had fully turned toward her now, no longer pretending, no longer whispering, every eye fixed on the woman they had just dismissed, and the reality forming in front of them refused to fit into the version of her they had already decided was true. Daniel pushed through the edge of the crowd, stopping just inside the terrace doors, close enough to see her clearly, far enough that he had to choose whether to step out or remain where he stood. And for the first time that evening, uncertainty was no longer hidden in him, it was visible, sharp, undeniable. "Avery." He called out, not loudly, but enough for the sound to carry across the terrace, the single word breaking through the controlled rhythm of the night. She paused, just for a fraction of a second, not turning fully, not offering him the moment he had withheld from her before, but acknowledging the sound of her name. His voice followed, steadier now but edged with something he could not quite contain. "What is this?" It was not an accusation. Not yet, but it was not understanding either. It was The beginning of realization, the kind that arrives too late to change what has already been decided. Avery turned slightly then, enough for her profile to catch the light, enough for him to see her expression clearly, calm, composed, untouched by the confusion that was now spreading through the room behind him. "This," she said quietly, "is me leaving." The simplicity of the words carried more weight than anything louder could have. Daniel stepped forward instinctively, crossing the threshold. Onto the terrace, the cool night air meeting him as if marking the boundary between the world he controlled and the one he did not understand. "You do not have to do this," he added, his voice lowering, almost as if he believed this could still be handled privately, corrected, contained. Avery's gaze met his fully now, steady, clear, and in that moment there was no anger, no bitterness, just a clarity that made everything else feel smaller. "You already made that decision," she replied, her tone even, not sharp, not soft, simply final. The man who had stepped out of the helicopter remained respectfully behind her, waiting, not interrupting, his presence a quiet confirmation that this moment belonged to her, not to the room watching, not to the man calling her name. Daniel's expression shifted again, something tightening, something breaking through the careful control he had maintained all evening. "At least tell me what is going on," he said, and this time there was a trace of urgency beneath the words, not for the crowd, not for his family, but for himself, because the narrative he had accepted was slipping away from him. Avery held his gaze for a long second, long enough for the weight of everything unsaid to settle between them. Then she took a small step back, not retreating, but creating distance that could no longer be crossed by simple words. "You will find out," she said, and for the first time, there was a hint of something else in her voice, not revenge, not pride, but certainty, the kind that does not need to prove itself. Behind Daniel, the murmurs in the ballroom had grown louder, fragmented pieces of recognition beginning to connect, names being whispered, headlines forming in real time. Eleanor had moved closer to the glass now, her composure intact but her eyes sharper, calculating. Chloe stood just behind her, no longer the center of attention, her earlier confidence dimmed by a shift she could not control. Avery turned away from them then, fully this time, releasing the last thread that tied her to that room. She walked toward the helicopter without looking back again, each step carrying her further from the version of herself they thought they knew. The man beside the aircraft opened the door for her, his movement precise, respectful, as if this moment was part of something far larger than the scene unfolding behind them. Avery paused at the threshold, just for a heartbeat, not out of hesitation, but to take in the stillness that existed between endings and beginnings. Then she stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a soft, final sound, and as the helicopter blades began to spin faster, lifting the aircraft from the ground, the truth that had been invisible only minutes ago became impossible to ignore. Because the woman they had just let walk away was not leaving their world, she was rising above it. The helicopter rose steadily into the Los Angeles night, its powerful blades carving through the air with a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial, as if marking the end of something that could never be rebuilt. Inside the cabin, Avery Brooks sat in composed silence, the city lights stretching beneath her like a map of possibilities rather than limitations, her reflection faintly visible in the dark glass. Not the woman they had dismissed minutes ago, but someone far more defined, far more certain. She did not look down at the ballroom, not yet. Instead she let the distance grow, let the altitude reshape the moment into something clearer, something undeniable. Below, on the terrace, Daniel Hayes stood frozen, his eyes fixed on the aircraft as it lifted higher. The wind from the blades had already faded, but the impact remained, pressing into him with a force he had not anticipated. Behind him, the ballroom no longer felt controlled. Conversations had fractured into urgent whispers, fragments of recognition spreading faster than anyone could contain. "Brooks," someone said, barely above a breath. "Did she say Brooks?" Another voice followed, sharper now. "Brooks Global. That cannot be a coincidence." Eleanor Hayes turned sharply at that, her composure still intact but her attention fully engaged. The name carried weight, not the kind that was spoken casually in rooms like this, but the kind that shifted markets, that redirected influence. She stepped closer to one of the guests who had spoken, her voice low, precise. "Clarify what you mean." The man hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if unsure whether to continue, then nodded slightly. "Brooks Global Holdings. New York-based, private investment group. They have been acquiring assets quietly for the last 3 years, very aggressive, very discreet." The words landed carefully, but their meaning expanded quickly, filling the gaps that had been ignored moments earlier. Chloe's expression faltered, just slightly, the confidence that had anchored her presence now slipping under the weight of something she could not control. Daniel did not move, did not turn. His focus remained locked on the sky, on the woman he had just allowed to walk away, and for the first time, the narrative he had accepted began to collapse under the pressure of reality. Inside the helicopter, Avery finally shifted her gaze downward, the ballroom now reduced to a distant glow, the people within it indistinguishable, their voices replaced by silence. She opened her hand slowly, looking at the ring resting in her palm, the diamond no longer a symbol of belonging, but of something completed, something closed with intention rather than regret. Across from her, the man who had greeted her earlier sat with quiet professionalism, a tablet resting in his hand. He did not speak until she looked up. "The board is assembled," he said, his tone respectful, efficient. "They are waiting for your final confirmation." Avery nodded once, not rushed, not hesitant, simply aligned. "Proceed," she replied, her voice calm, grounded, and with that single word, the next phase began. Below, in the ballroom, a large screen near the stage flickered unexpectedly, drawing attention away from the terrace, from the sky, from the speculation that had already begun to spiral. The display shifted from the scheduled program to something else entirely, bold lettering forming against a dark background. Brooks Global Holdings. The room stilled again, not with confusion this time, but with recognition, with realization. Names that had been whispered now stood visible, undeniable. A second line appeared beneath it, acquisition announcement pending. Daniel turned sharply toward the screen, his mind connecting the pieces faster now. The helicopter, the name, the timing. Avery. Eleanor's expression hardened, not in anger, but in calculation, as if recalibrating an entire strategy in real time. The room no longer saw Avery as an outsider, no longer saw her as someone who had been removed. They saw her as something else entirely, something they had failed to recognize until it was already too late. And as the helicopter disappeared further into the night, the truth settled into the room with quiet certainty. They had not pushed her out, they had misjudged her completely, and now they were about to understand exactly what that mistake would cost. The screen did not flicker again, it held steady, bold and undeniable, as if it had been waiting for the exact moment to reveal itself. Brooks Global Holdings remained fixed in towering letters, no longer a whisper, no longer speculation, but a declaration that filled the ballroom with a different kind of silence, one that carried weight, consequence, and realization. Daniel Hayes stood motionless, his eyes locked on the display, his mind moving faster than the room around him, connecting the fragments he had ignored, the details he had overlooked, the woman he had underestimated, and now every piece aligned into a truth that felt both sudden and inevitable. Behind him, conversations shifted from curiosity to urgency, voices lowering not out of politeness but out of caution, because this was no longer about social standing, it was about power, real power, the kind that reshaped companies, industries, futures. Eleanor Hayes stepped forward, her posture still composed, still commanding, but her focus had sharpened into something far more strategic. She did not react emotionally, she recalculated, her eyes scanning the screen, the guests, the shifting alliances forming in real time. "Get me information," she said quietly to one of her associates, her tone precise, controlled, but beneath it was an unmistakable edge, the kind that appeared only when control began to slip. Chloe Bennett took a small step back, her earlier confidence dissolving into uncertainty. The role she had stepped into moments ago now felt unstable, unsupported, because the narrative that had elevated her was collapsing under the weight of something far larger than she had anticipated. Daniel finally moved, not toward the terrace this time, but toward the center of the room, toward the screen, toward the truth he could no longer avoid. His reflection merged briefly with the bold letters displayed behind him, a visual contrast that did not go unnoticed by those watching, because in that moment, he was no longer the center of power in the room, he was reacting to it, and that shift was visible, undeniable. Above them, far beyond the reach of the ballroom, the helicopter carried Avery through the night. With smooth precision, the city unfolding beneath her in a quiet, endless pattern of light and shadow. She sat with calm focus, no longer looking back, no longer tied to the moment she had left behind. In front of her, the tablet screen displayed the details of the acquisition, figures, timelines, structures, all aligned with the decision she had already made. The man across from her spoke again, his voice steady, professional. "The announcement will finalize once you confirm the integration terms." Avery nodded slightly, her gaze steady, her thoughts clear. "Proceed with full acquisition," she said, each word measured, deliberate, final, the kind of decision that did not need to be repeated. the kind that reshaped everything it touched. Below, the ballroom screen shifted once more, updating in real time. Acquisition confirmed. The words appeared without fanfare, without explanation, but their impact was immediate. A ripple of reaction moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but controlled, intense, because everyone understood what it meant. Daniel's company, his empire, was no longer entirely his. The structure had changed, the control had shifted, and the timing made it impossible to ignore the connection. Eleanor's expression did not break, but her eyes hardened, calculating the implications, the leverage, the response. She had spent decades mastering control, and now she faced something she had not anticipated, someone she had dismissed. Chloe remained silent. Her presence now secondary, almost invisible in a room that had redirected its focus entirely. Daniel exhaled slowly, the weight of realization settling into him with a clarity that cut through everything else. He turned slightly, looking once more toward the terrace, toward the empty space where Avery had stood, and for the first time, the absence felt heavier than her presence ever had, because it was no longer just personal, it was structural, strategic, irreversible. And as the room continued to absorb the shift, to adjust to the new reality unfolding in front of them, one truth became impossible to ignore. The woman they had chosen to remove had just rewritten the terms of their entire world, and she had done it without raising her voice, without asking for recognition, without looking back. The room did not erupt, it shifted, quietly, precisely, like a system recalibrating under new ownership. The screen remained lit with the confirmation that no one could undo, no one could reinterpret, and in that stillness, the weight of what had just happened settled into every corner of the ballroom. Daniel Hayes stood in the center of it, no longer the architect of the moment, but a man standing inside the consequences of his own decision. His gaze moved from the screen to the terrace once more, as if expecting something to change, as if expecting her to return and explain it all in a way that would make sense of the night. But the terrace remained empty, the glass reflecting only the room behind him, and that reflection showed him something he had not seen before. Not power, not control, but absence. The absence of the one person who had just shifted everything without asking for permission. Eleanor Hayes moved closer to him, her presence still composed, still formidable, but there was no denial left in her expression, only calculation. "We need to respond immediately," she said quietly, her voice low enough to avoid drawing attention, but firm enough to signal urgency. Daniel did not answer right away, his thoughts still catching up to reality. "She planned this," he said finally, not as an accusation, but as a realization forming in real time. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "No," she replied, "she prepared for it." The distinction landed with precision, because preparation meant foresight, control, patience, things that had been completely overlooked. Across the room, the guests had begun to reposition themselves, alliances shifting, conversations turning toward opportunity rather than spectacle. Because the narrative had changed, Avery Brooks was no longer a question, she was a factor, and factors like her redefined outcomes. Chloe Bennett stood near the edge now, no longer at Daniel's side, her earlier confidence replaced by quiet uncertainty. The space she had occupied moments ago no longer existed in the same way, and she seemed to understand that. Without needing it to be said, Daniel finally exhaled, a slow, controlled release, and in that moment, something inside him shifted, not outwardly dramatic, not visible to most, but fundamental. He reached into his pocket, pulling out his phone, the screen lighting up instantly with notifications, headlines already forming, messages already arriving. The world outside had not waited, it had reacted, and it was reacting fast. One headline caught his attention immediately: Brooks Global finalizes major acquisition in Los Angeles. The timing, the wording, the precision, it all aligned too perfectly to ignore. He looked up again, not at the screen this time, but at the space where she had been, and for the first time, he understood the scale of what he had lost. Not just a relationship, not just a partner, but a force he had failed to recognize until it was already beyond his reach. High above the city, the helicopter moved smoothly through the night, its path steady, its destination clear. Inside, Avery Brooks sat with quiet composure, the tablet in front of her now displaying confirmation after confirmation, each detail aligning exactly as intended. She did not rush through them, she reviewed them with precision, with care, because this was not about proving anything to the room she had left behind. This was about executing what had already been set in motion long before that night. She opened her hand once more, the ring still resting in her palm, a small, quiet reminder of a chapter that had served its purpose. She studied it for a brief moment, not with regret, not with longing, but with clarity. Then she leaned slightly forward and placed it on the empty seat beside her. Not discarded, not thrown away, but set aside, exactly where it belonged. In the past, the city lights reflected in the window beside her, stretching endlessly, offering no limits, no boundaries, only direction. She looked out at them, her expression calm, resolved, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible breath, not of relief, but of arrival, because this was not an escape, this was not a reaction, this was a continuation of something she had been building long before anyone in that ballroom had decided who she was. And as the helicopter moved forward into the distance, leaving the night behind it undisturbed, one truth remained: the woman they had chosen to underestimate had not just walked away, she had moved ahead, and everything they believed about her had been left far below, exactly where it belonged.